Hello, everyone, and we are graced again with James Tunney. And this interview, I think, is going to follow naturally enough, both from the things that James and I discussed, about 2 months ago now, but also, I had an interview with Timothy Sean Quinn of Xavier University, in which we talked a bit about Machiavelli, Francis Niccolo Machiavelli, Francis Bacon, Rene Descartes, and how the origins of science are connected in an intimate way with how modernity reframes the political. And in that interview, we were taking sort of a high level view, looking at what's going on conceptually with respect to that relationship. But I think we might here enter into more concrete aspects of that intersection. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, James. Certainly, well, your most recent work is, well, I'll just turn it over to you here. The Prince, you can talk about some of your more recent publications if you wish, or we can just treat it
Yeah.
topic.
Okay. Well,
So,
I think I can see in your work and your discussions certain themes which emerge, and they have emerged in my own studies, and they are emerging. So when you talked and began to talk about the prince, it's a thing that I've been thinking about a lot, a slightly different way. And you've laid the foundation in your previous talk with Professor Quinn. So we don't have to go over those grounds. But what I'm interested in particular is this recurrent and significant motif, symbol, myth of the prince, and what it means and how it means and what it means in relation to the things we're talking about, Scientocracy. Now, my views are clear for anyone that doesn't know them about where we are. I've explained that I believe that we have to develop spiritually, that I've explained that in the context of light and spirituality and the mystical accord. And I've explained that the greatest threat to us is from tech bondage and becoming slaves to technology. And I've articulated that in terms of an empire of scientism, which we can describe as a technocracy, or a scientocracy was a theme that it was useful for us. And we've talked about that. And the principality fits into this, as you have explained and as you've discussed in your talk, the connection between Machiavelli and other thinking, Francis Bacon in particular. And I want to explore that a bit further and to emphasize some important points about which I think they're important. Now, some of these drift into less the philosophical or the mythic, or that we have to kind of think in a wider sense. And I know you're exploring the context of myth, which is very important. We may end up talking about that hopefully in the future as well. But the prince is a recurrent subject in myth as well. And of course, in the context of a representation of the liberating figure, we have the prince, and we have the prince in an ugly state as well, the frog prince, but that becomes beautiful, which psychoanalysts talk about being about sexuality, and there's a whole range of different Freudian and Jungian interpretations of what that means. But the figure of the prince is important. And the prince is important as well as someone who's coming into being and is not the king, who is not something higher than themselves, I think, as well, in a common sense idea of the idea of the prince. That's not inevitable because the word prince, in reference to princeps and leader, is a more generic term as well. But actually, the particular office of a prince has been important. And in particular, because that waiting role, the one who is to come. But it also ties into deeper esoteric ideas about principalities. And we can look at that in Christian terms in relation to angelic realms. In all these cases about the prince, there's a kind of good prince and a bad prince, or a counterfeit prince, or whatever, a positive and negative. There's the office, and then there's the one who assumes it correctly or incorrectly. We might look at it in that sense. It's not an easy separation, but We see the idea, the anticipation in Isaiah of Christ as the Prince of Peace, for example. And of course, we have a juxtaposition with a Manichaean idea of the Prince of Darkness and a recurrent idea of the Prince of Darkness. And in that idea of the Prince of Darkness is the sense of someone who's not the king, but attempts to usurp through various techniques the kingdom, or wants to control or become the king, or we say, you might even say, the Lion King, or the kind of elements of that motif. It's a recurrent kind of mythic sense. So when the choice of the prince for Machiavelli, of course, refers to the particular context, but there's a mythic element behind it which is important, and in that is the implication as well that we're talking about a total worldview. It's consciousness in a number of different levels, informed directly or indirectly by whatever concept one has of the higher regions. And this, we might think in terms of, for example, in Britain, the divine right of kings after the Reformation. But this wasn't a new idea as it's sold as a new idea. It was an ancient idea, and it was particularly advanced by people like Saint Columba in the 6th century, where the monks became the arbiters of the relationship between kings and God. So you needed the approval or the blessing, and they got heavily involved with that, which may explain why still the monarch in Britain will be crowned on top of an old stone, which goes back to these ideas of kingship. And we also see that ancient idea manifest in the legends before they became the Arthurian legends, the Fisher King, and the idea that if you would have a wasteland if there was something wrong with the king, and that's developed in ideas of magic and James Fraser. And we in modern terms, well, what do we make of all this? My central concept in explaining what's going on in the world is that what we're dealing, everything is about governance, everything. And everything is about governance of intelligence and intelligences. That's, if you want to boil it down, what the whole meaning of this life is about the struggle over governance of intelligences. So this is a theme you couldn't examine Shakespeare without seeing that he's talking about actual governance and the deeper elements. It's right through literature, it's right through politics, it's right through philosophy. And the problem is that we've forgotten about what intelligence is. And I may have mentioned this before, but really what we have to consider as well, just to reiterate, is that intelligence in the sense used in the Elizabethan era included intelligence between ourselves, the intelligence of the other, and the intelligences of the other world. So we have a total view of intelligence. And what the magician is doing, what the governor is doing, what the king is doing is managing, or the prince attempting to, is to manage intelligences. And with this, so in that medieval view, it was the totality of the world. It wasn't just managing your little kingdom, it was the totality. And then when we go through the scientific revolution, and we go through the electricity, and we go through the application of electricity to the human body, and Aldini and Galvani, and the influence of Frankenstein, they're beginning to say, hold on a second, there's some vital physical force that may explain that. And then we have the development of the idea of the field and associated with electricity in the mid-19th century, coming up to the quantum field and that. The ambition to govern intelligence now extends to the totality of human consciousness in all the range of potential. And that was mentioned, Professor Quinn was talking about that in one quote he used, I think from Bacon, and he was referring to Atlantis, a new Atlantis. It's about the government of all possibility, really. So what we have failed to understand is that the ambition of the people who want to control us using this instrumental scientific scientism perspective, using the materialist philosophy and using particular ideas, they want utter dominance of anything that can be dominated. It's an utter, it's like George Carlin said, but much worse. It's everything, including your soul as they conceive it. So the principality now that we're talking about has changed, and there's two evidences of the extensions of Machiavellian thinking. which I'll come back to in a second, but just to mention as well that when we look at Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, we see not just this interest in the unseen world and the ghosts and the failure to communicate, as we see it in Macbeth, and of course they're all about governance. But we see also they're talking about engineering and engineered machines. These are words that there's a book called The Machine and text written about this here, and it explains about how the machine was coming into the consciousness and how that operated. And of course, we had the printing press as a forerunner, which kind of become a model as well of how the brain works. So the idea of the political machine and the specialization of something which is independent of other force and cut off from above. It was cut at this connection with the claim to the divine was cut really. And they said, well, okay, we can extract that. We can have a system. And that was manifested in the Reformation. It was manifest in Henry VIII's perspectives and Cromwell and the people around him, Thomas Cromwell. And right through the Reformation, we're talking about the struggle between the Catholic Church and the princes. And that goes back to struggles like in the 13th century with Frederick II, the Holy Roman Empire, and the papacy. And then the struggles in Avignon and the struggles between Italy and France. What we're talking about in many contexts is not about the power of the Catholic Church, because it's never been as unified as people think. But we're talking about struggles between princes, of which the papacy becomes a pawn and things. And this is even evidence in the Crusade. There's even evidence in when Frederick goes to Jerusalem, and there's a lot of debates about why is he forming alliances, with Muslims. It's a lot more complex. So during the Reformation, of course, the princes have a role. So in Marburg, the colloquy of Marburg in 1529, they bring Zwingli together. And I was in Marburg a few weeks ago, and so there's an old street there where Luther stayed when he was there in October, and they were trying to work out what they agreed on. They couldn't agree on the transubstantiation and what the Eucharist meant, but they could agree on a lot of things. And that was organized by the prince. So the prince is the key person who's working on the theological sense. So instead of the royal figure or the leader needing the blessing of other forces and linking up to higher forces, that loop is cut, and the prince is not only dealing with with statecraft, but they're looking to rule the whole world in that sense. Now, the last point is just the modern manifestations, or where it's come to, who we look to, is Gramsci in the 20s. Machiavelli was important for him, but he redefines him. And before that, 1911 is H.G. Wells. Now, H.G. Wells, as I've done a talk with Jeff on that, on the detail. H.G. Wells is arguably the most significant political theorist that people don't know as a political theorist. And in his work, he lays out the New World Order. He spells it out. It's in his work. Most people don't look at the gory details, the novels. But he also wrote the new Machiavelli in 1911. So again, we have the idea of Machiavelli, but in a different thing. So Gramsci and H.G. Wells point to the continuous relevance of this figure of the prince. So who does the prince represent now? The prince represents the shift of power to different forces, consistent with what happened in medieval France, whereby the princes set up networks of support which were independent of the official power structures, of mutual reliance, which will rely on bribery and prizes and presents to bring people into the network to guarantee power. So the networks became important through the action of certain people like princes. And these networks are the basis of the contemporary context. Network power that Manuel Castells and people have explained are the essence. But so the principality is not the old states that we're talking about. This is part of the illusion that we have. It's the management of the infrastructure, of the network, of the technological system that has been laid down from the 1850s, the global network that's all around you. It's linking us. It's everywhere in our environment. Is the application of the various attempts to govern electromagnetism and apply it for the system. And even if you look at key papers, electromagnetism, it's, they use the word governors. Governors is critical. It's about governing these realms, consistent with that idea of governing nature, Bacon, etc. As we know, cybernetics is, as you well know. So okay, so that's probably enough. I went on too long as an opening.
No, it's an evocative. I mean, there's a lot going on. I had not really appreciated the extent to which that sort of archetypal category of the prince was so relevant to reflection upon the contemporary. And you invoke Hamlet. I always think Hamlet is a fascinating play composed near the dawn of modernity, because within it you have this articulation of how damning actually the disillusionment which is being fostered by emergent science can be, right? Look you, the sky is brave, all hanging firmament. Right, seemeth to me no other thing than a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors. And then he goes on from there. What a piece of work is a man, a noble reason, and so on, right? But what is this but a quintessence of dust? And that's Hamlet talking to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, providing sort of like in sort of a very sort of concise way this criticism of what's happening with the emergence of the sciences. And then Hamlet himself is this diffident, ambivalent character, lacking resolution. Even his ultimate resolution is kind of pyrrhic in character. And so you have like this emptiness, this evacuation of what could be a noble indication of what it is to be a prince. And you can contrast with sort of the, there's like this like wrong, but we don't want to get too lost in Shakespeare.
Okay.
I mean, it's way too easy to do that. But before we really sink into 20th century and so forth, 19th, 20th century, one other thing that occurs to me as you speak, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on this, because I think it joins this, is the perennial tension between the monarchy and the aristocracy, where the aristocracy, the nobles and so forth, or the princes, often are at odds with the monarchy. This becomes relevant, with the arbitration of certain issues in emergent capitalism, where oftentimes the monarchy ends up assuming the more progressive orientation, and the aristocracy undermines that. I mean, that's sort of what happens with the ancient regime and so forth, right? How does that connect to the arc? So that's a question. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, the tensions between monarchies and aristocracies, whether, I mean, maybe that's an irrelevant tangent. I don't know. And secondarily, well, it's not secondary. Secondly, though, in order, if not in importance, right? What happens, what seems to me to be happening is that the office of the prince is invested with a kind of ressentiment. There's a resentment and a rejection of the narrative of tradition, which informs the contemporary prince, leading him to act in bad faith with reference to his responsibilities. And then this is actually fully incarnated to the projects of science that are then attempting to completely dominate the world in a way which cuts people off from a more transcendent discourse. So those are the two questions.
Yeah. So in relation to the monarchy, I think in some context, the power of the monarchy is overemphasized. It's the system that we have to look at. For example, I think that we have to look at, say, in Spain, we have to look at the colonial system after 1492 and the Reconquista. It's the apparatus of the control of colonialism, dealing with the New World and Seville and places like that, that really becomes the structure of power. So there's a shift in some senses as well. There's a leaching of actual power towards systems over a period of time. So it becomes difficult to consider the monarchy in the same way that one would have. They become facilitative of networks that power contain, and they seek to maintain their connection in networks. And I think there's been an underestimation to what extent royal networks may have altered and transformed into other forms. So it's not so much in the traditional sense of looking at the person and the position, but in relation to the office as spread out through the system. So that I would emphasize. You're exactly right in relation to this sense. The sense and why the prince is so powerful is because they haven't got something, they want something. And that's why in many religious, esoteric, spiritual senses is the prince needs to convince people to come on their side. They have limited power, but they have power enough to be able to exert themselves on something. So that's this idea that the Prince of Darkness has to persuade you in order to come over. You have to voluntarily engage with them to be a player in their principality. And that's a very deep notion in relation to ideas. But in that, yes, it is this question of the transition and the death of the father. It's going on this idea which represents tradition in many senses. And some people would say patriarchy at the time of Queen Elizabeth. I mean, I think there's an overestimation of the engagement of men in power structures, and underestimation of the power of women if we look at medieval periods. Because if you weren't in the system, you didn't have the power. There was a different relationships of power that have been oversimplified in retrospective context. But definitely it's a protest against the tradition being changed, and literally about God the Father being chucked out of the picture, because the prince is saying, well, I can be the boss here. I can run the church, so we can just cut out this connection. So there's this sense as well. I think there is that deeper sense, and so it explains the motivation of the prince. The prince has this desire for power, and is also unscrupulous, because the ends justify the means and all the other things, because we're abolishing the restraints on the exercise of power, that there's a shift towards the ends, and the ends are power itself. So get power over nature, be able to use potential, to use instruments, to use the tools over the network in whatever way possible. So there is it does represent it symbolically represents the forces, one of modernity, and modernity in the older sense, going back to the Normans, in the longer sense of institutional modernity in Britain, before it becomes a more modern modernity, but in relation to the roots of power structures that led to the Anglo-spheric kind of control of communication technology and building of a structure. Building structures that weren't necessarily economic for the future as they were doing. So I think those things are right. And then there's the other element, that it's a mythic element. There's a mythic element to it. So therefore, it's subject to manipulation, which is an important point.
I think that's where Bacon, in some respects, is such an astonishing author, because he's very brazen. He's brazen in the Organon and in the New Atlantis, in what he's suggesting, and his language is quite violent with respect to what he advocates vis-a-vis nature, putting nature on a rack and so forth. I don't think that's idle or innocent language. There's an activity there. But to come back to the Prince, I wonder if you could say more about H.G. Wells' take on it, right? And as opposed to the original, like not Machiavelli's Prince, which incidentally, as you talk, you see, well, all of that's there in that text, right? It's basically an instruction manual of how to operate within the network in a fashion which maximizes power, and then sort of the metaphysic which it invokes is a metaphysic of fortune, quite literally, right? Virtue and fortune. But what is the virtue of the prince? The virtue of the prince is a kind of unrepentant ruthlessness and a management of appearances to affect the outcomes it desired, right? So that's I mean, there's a real consistency there. That we move forward, then again, wondering if you could say more about H.G. Wells and his approach to that category.
Yeah. As you're saying that, it's important to emphasize one of the things that you did talk about, but the idea of appearances, which is critical. It's critical in Shakespeare, it's critical in Machiavelli. So the idea of the surface thing and controlling the look and feel of something as opposed to substance, and especially, which is quite appropriate when you have disengaged with the spiritual world, that you're in more of a world of appearances, because there is no substance to some of these things. They're insubstantial. So what we do have a shift from is from the cosmic to the cosmetic, which are actually etymologically are the same. But it's very, very significant about the appearances. So there's an essay by Philip K. Dick in 1955 called The Chromium Fence. It's a very short essay. And in the future, the world is divided into the purists and the naturalists. The naturalists want to retain the human body as it is and not be interfered with. And the purist wants to progress, moving on the body. So everything is about how your hair looks, how your teeth look, and also whether you're going to get your sweat glands removed, because body odor is bad. So everyone, all the purists, want to remove their sweat glands. And what Philip K. Dick explained in that was a very, very important idea, that transhumanism, a lot of it is very much related to cosmetics, to cosmetic industry, the idea that we are appearance, the idea that we're not deep or something, that we're something insubstantial. Very, very deep idea. But a lot of it does go back, you see, to this reaction, a shift from the cosmic, you're a cosmic being with cosmic consciousness, part of a whole world, to something cosmetic, focus on the appearance. It kind of anticipates an awful lot of this shallow society that we live in, the society of the spectacle and all that. It really anticipates that in relation to a very sharp idea of the cosmetic approach, which really is sharp. It can really damage humanity in that sense. So in relation to H.G. Wells specifically, he wrote, it was regarded as that particular novel, The New Machiavelli, as autobiographical, and he's referring to some figures that existed around the time of the Fabian figures, and he was kind of referring to them in the book. So he was using it. There's liberal reference. People knew who this referred to. So a lot of the novel, it was about a member of Parliament, as far as I remember, was reflected his own views. And it starts off, the politician is saying that Machiavelli is great, but it's too old-fashioned because he's focusing on the state. That's a key thing. And the world has changed so much. Power is so more diffuse, and power is in much different places than we thought it is. And this is a great failure of a lot of political theorists to believe that, and international relations theorists, to believe in that realist school of state management still, and they still believe in that. They still believe, it's kind of absurd in relation to when one examines networks of power. So statecraft was one, and the second issue was that Machiavelli hadn't dealt with women and hadn't sufficiently considered the revolutionary impact of women in society and power structures. And this was, of course, at a time of the movement towards the suffragettes and all that kind of stuff. But also where H.G. Wells knows that this is a revolutionary movement in relation to power structures. And in that, he's advocating a more liberal view in relation to sex. Now, this is an important issue as a matter of governance, as opposed to of what one's views are in relation to sexual matters. Right? It's not about that. It's about issues in relation to government and the use of these issues. It comes back again. I'll come back to that issue in relation to another figure, Arthur C. Clarke, which fits into this picture, which is important. So he wants to be, implicit is that H.G. Wells is the new Machiavelli, or some of the figures, or his role is a new Machiavelli towards this new powerful position. So you can come without power, and you can, that's the implication for me of that. That's 1911. And a decade or so after, Gramsci, in his prison diaries, addresses Machiavelli. And of course, Mussolini refers to Machiavelli. So Machiavelli is similar to Nietzsche in that way, in that supposedly opposing forces can really both use them, like people know about the Nazis and Nietzsche. They don't read about the Bolsheviks and Nietzsche. So and also critical idea of that period, which is critical to come into this equation, which is critical for the Bolsheviks, which is critical for all these people, is the idea of myth building, of building myths for the new world, of getting rid of the old myths and building. It's a constructing, and the Bolsheviks did this all the time, trying to apply Moses in the context of a narrative, of dialectic materialism, all this kind of stuff, use the language appropriated for their mission. It's very, very important to understand why myth was so important, and also the attempt to change factual Christianity into mythology was a big endeavor of the 19th century Germans, and through an Oriental influence in particular, and through particular narrow forms of scholarship. So we have all this mythologized, this awareness of the power of myth that we still don't accept. We still don't understand how mythic our world is, how mythic our thought processes is, how non-logical or rational they really are, that we respond to a whole range of nudges and etc. So what's important about Gramsci when he comes along, and of course he's sharing the same materialist worldview as H.G. Wells, and H.G. Wells, of course, is very sympathetic towards communism, and he's very sympathetic towards capitalism. All he's saying, and colonialism, just bring them together because they all believe in the same thing, which is correct. They all believe in a unified control, elitist control of the collective by a materialist philosophy, which is scientific. I mean, they really share the same things, whatever else differences we want. So he didn't see a problem in unifying them, as he explained. The future of empire would be empire transmuting into a relationship, a combination with commerce and all the other forces. And also, there's another person working on myth, George Sorel, and in relation to syndicalism. There's another aspect of it. So what Gramsci said, the important thing is, he talks about the myth king, or the myth prince. So he says the myth prince now has to be a collective, a group. It has to be a corporate thing. It's not an individual. So he's using this, sometimes coded, whatever, to refer to the Communist Party or to refer to the future governance system, but he's referring to the embodiment in a corporate structure, which of course is what is the same thing that H.G. Wells wanted. So the prince becomes more of a principality of governance. It's a collective, which will be elite and
So
the
personhood of the prince is abandoned.
Yeah.
Which I don't think is a trivial point, actually, because
No, I don't think so. He's been in prison, spending a long time thinking about these issues, changing his view about Machiavelli. He taught Machiavelli. He changed his view on over time. It's so, and he's kind of thinking that Machiavelli is in some way coming alive in his work, that there's some kind of spirit of view, I'd probably call it, in the work. He has an unusual view. He thinks the structure of his work is important. But out of that, he extracts this shift towards the corporate prince, towards the idea of the myth prince being a group. And it's fundamentally important. And I've argued that a lot of people do not understand the power of corporate structures. Now, we know all the books about how corporations run the world and all that, but we really don't engage in discussions of the corporate personality, which is the word they use, because they legally have personality. That's why companies can own and buy and sell things, because they have legal personality. We've constructed this fiction, but the fiction is a powerful influence. So Machiavelli remains very important, and he remains very important for two of the major figures of the 20th century in relation to political philosophy, because, of course, Gramsci is associated with the idea of utilizing alternative means, using the whole field really to come in and attack hegemony and to come up from all sides, from cultural side to war against religion, to remove the obstacles towards the unfolding of the materialist kind of paradigm. It's again the total field of operations comes into play, and again, people who might oppose that idea have been too unduly focused on the old channels. So it's very, very interesting. If you see it, it feeds into, say, Trotskyism, for example. It's quite amazing that there's a very interesting book on the modern history of Trotskyism in Britain. And around the time of Thatcher, for example, there's 20,000 Trotskyists in Britain, but they never achieved political success ostensibly at the polls. But they are the most hard-working of all the political groups. So their achievements are on domains that we're not looking at. So the principality is a much wider sense, including culture, which is so far wider than the concept of statecraft that it really demands a huge extension in order to appreciate what the current context is, the contemporary context, including the consideration of corporate forms as a critical element of our world order, future world order.
So there's three questions, or three very open sort of moments here of reflection. Yeah. One is that, and I'm almost hesitant to do this because I don't like didactically connecting dots too much for people. Like, if it's mere exposition isn't always effective, but just with respect to trying to illuminate how relevant these sort of framings are that you're offering are, the power, there's a question of appearance and the importance of the cosmetic. I don't think, has there been a time in history where the cosmetic has exhibited such potency in so many domains? Certainly, the events of the past 4 to 5 years have exemplified that, with reference to a narrative that was formulated and which really was demonstrably vacant of substance. You had this alleged pestilence that, upon any real scrutiny, is revealed to be at most possibly a slightly more intense upper respiratory infection than that of your garden variety. Even that's contended. But on the basis of this situation, you had justified all these measures that were deployed to conduce to all kinds of things, from movements toward digital currency, expanded surveillance, authoritarianism, all the rest of it, right? So the cosmetic right there on display, not just there. Now you're seeing a transition to, it's not really a transition because it's been in the background for decades now, but the drum beats are, the tempo is kicking up over, and this is like over the question of climate, and you even have these manifestly hubristic schemes to try and control the atmosphere and things like this, which exceed human competency in really pretty obvious ways. But then that's like a sideline, right? The main point is that you have offered a myth of catastrophe which again is predicated on cosmetics. So what you're talking about in terms of the shift from the cosmic to the cosmetic, I'm just wanting, as that initial moment, to highlight how significant that is with reference to how the political conversation is being shaped. And then this is sort of distinct but related with reference to networks and where are the real loci of power. Uh, they really no longer are situated within the state. And not that the state has completely gone away, right? But Ian Davis, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but I find it useful. He puts it in terms of the global public private partnership, right? And so the institutions, the relevant institutions, and then within the institutions, it's not even institutions. There are actual concrete people and players with names and addresses, as the phrase go, that interact in a particular way. Um, and you don't and because they're acting as a network as opposed to like singular agents, it's very difficult to resist them uh, in one's own right. Those are the first two moments, and the third. Well, I remember the third point. I'll actually bracket that, but I was going to, but it was just in terms of not leaving people in suspense. Was that this issue of men and women and power and what's going on in that sphere? I think itself is merits exploration, but we can bracket that because it's not as immediately connected to what you're saying as the other two things which I raised. So I'll leave, and we can come back to that. I'm not afraid of doing that, but it's sort of a different sort of leg of the journey. So what? So I sort of. What are your thoughts there on those terms?
Um, yes, the cosmetic function, as Philip K. Dick unbelievably understood in 1955 from that short little essay, in my view, was a real lever into transhumanism. You know, we can make you beautiful, people will love you. When I came to the United States a long time ago, what amazed me was on the television, all the ads, and all the ads were trying to belittle the audience, make them feel bad, make them feel left out because they hadn't got this product, make them feel, low self-esteem by looking at all these things. And then I began to see it years later in the way people behaved sometimes and their attitudes. They really transformed into the reality for some people. This was how you thought. This was the social modus of thinking. And all of that, of course, represents the movement away from cosmic consciousness, from divine consciousness, from the bigger force. And it's very, very deep. So in relation to, without getting in or going off on tangent about climate issues, but it is incredible when you look at the literature in relation to the range of substances in the atmosphere. And we know that from 1964, or 63, 64, they were using geoengineering in Southeast Asia for their purposes, US government. That's an official thing. It's a long time they've been doing it, as well as the Russian, all this kind of stuff. We know they're doing that. There is an issue, a deep issue, about the technosphere, about the idea that, and it goes back to certainly there in Bacon, we're going to construct this new world. We're going to construct a world that you live in. This is the basis of the plantation system. We're going to adapt the nature for our purposes. We're going to subjugate it for our purposes. So in that is the almost a cosmic projection. I won't say cosmic, and just a kind of deep psychic projection of IKEA onto the world. It's an idea of something trivial and domestic being the total modus of the architecture of the future world. And the idea of architecture is crucial, and the idea of building is crucial. And we don't sufficiently investigate that, which I'll come back to just later on to finish that point. So the cosmetic is a deep shallowness. It's a very big shallowness. It's an all-encompassing shallowness. The shallowness is as shallow as the glass domes they probably have planned for us when they destroy the atmosphere. So it really is a different order of dangerous shallowness, which is paradoxical. And the public-private thing, yes, that's a very specific policy. And I want to give you an example of where this public-private thing and how it plays out. It's more devastating than people understand. I used to live in Spain about 30 years ago, or longer than that. And so, as I was interested in culture, history, come from a Catholic background, I would have visited any kind of major religious sites and be interested in the history and the culture and the art and investigate or whatever. I was in Spain for a month, whatever, during the summer, and what shocked me, and it doesn't seem to be shocking other people, is that now there's a paywall in most of the major cathedrals. So instead of the idea of the house of God, you come in and the security people, you pay in, they're museumified, they're museums, they've been taken over. So it really
genuinely
is
horrifying.
It is horrifying.
It shocks me. It shocks me. And that's 30 years ago. I imagine now it's even worse. But go on.
I don't know how I would describe the shock I felt, but it's that I don't mind cold water, but it's it's a colder thing sneaking in. You can feel the coldness in your heart. So there you go. So that this idea, even for the atheist, even for the people that never believe in God, they could stroll into a cathedral and have some sense of something, whatever level they wanted to, and they were welcome in that, especially in European cities where these things were built by people. So all over some of the key places where you had security guards with that kind of ethos that security guards have. And when asked, can Catholics come in here to pray? I mean, the kind of look of incomprehension was kind of it was shocking. And speaking in Spanish, that was the language issue. And then it was amazing. In the cathedral in Seville, there was a so-called tourist guide there, and informing me that I couldn't get into the thing. They were saying, well, why don't you go to the flamenco? Now, this is the thing that intellectuals have failed to do. One of the areas that I was regarded as one of the expertises I had, because there's official expertises in relation to certain legal practices, was in relation to travel and tourism law that most people have not heard of. Other lawyers used to laugh when I said I was a member of international bodies in that context, and been invited by UNESCO and people to go over and work to World Tourism Organization and all this. And the claim, the nice UNESCO, and if you look at the basis of their claims, it's a claim to universal heritage. It's a claim that all these things that are designated to be part of the patrimony, ironically, or something like that, is of universal heritage. And this is a brilliant mechanism to dissolve the connection with the actual people that created the thing. So I began to write about the local community and the significance of the local community. But to be honest, absolutely nobody was interested. 100% failure in the academic world on that. They're not really, there was a blankness of some of these issues. And sometimes years after they say, I begin to understand what you were saying. But so some of the solutions now are even gone to this. They don't understand. It's the same with nationalism, and people are saying, oh, hold on, we're losing the country, whatever. They are gone. They really are gone. So some of the old ideas, the foundations and the context have been taken away. Legally speaking, for example, Ireland gave up its sovereignty and shared its sovereignty after joining the European Union. So it's not an issue of debate, it's an issue of legal principle. So this church thing was really, because I was having a discussion with a traditional Catholic, and I said that I predict that the Catholic Church will be privatized. So no, that couldn't happen. No. Very intelligent man, very astute man, very informed man. So he wasn't being a trite or anything like that. But I said I believe that this is part of the agenda that will be literally taken over, and I could elaborate that some other time. But this for me is the privatization of that. So, so on a deep level, take it from the perspective of an atheist going there. They're taking away a public facility, a public space that's open to all, and they are turning it into a commercial operate. They have done that. So this mechanism by which this can happen through the global groups and public-private partnership, the mantras of privatization, which of course is kind of oligarchization or something like that. It's not got to do with it's a change. The use of words is very, very strange because your private thing has gone out of the picture. It's a devastating approach, and right through Europe, I was in about whatever 10 countries, whatever. I did have a sense that I was in post-Christian Europe, and a lot of people don't understand that in relation to actuality of religious practices and the marginalization, and people don't understand it, particularly in America. And a thing that annoys me dealing with some of my friends in America, not you, of course, in this context, but it was the casual way they contributed through lazy intellectual things towards this attack, utter attack on civilization itself. So the die is cast on that. The Rubicon has been passed. These things are not going to be undone. We're talking about the dismantling of huge cultural things. Why? Because it's clear on the globalist agenda, Peter, like the Irishman Peter Sutherland, that they cannot have a cultural homogeneity in any form because they need heterogeneity in diversity, heterogeneity to replace cultural homogeneity. Why? The essential reason why underneath that, in my view, is because it's not for any love of different people. It's not any love of the multicultural function. It's because you cannot have a guerrilla war against an occupying force if you don't have an homogenous force. It's as simple as that. And that's what the empire learned. The empire, critical in this, facing future national movements, realized that it couldn't have bodies of homogenous groups of people with similar belief that could be magnetized to oppose these things. So the privatization is a deep part of this principality. It's coming into your face. It's not only coming into your face, it's coming into your body and mind. So the conceit of this force is amazing. And I'm saying to myself, well, hold on a second. Now I try and, I don't follow the news anymore. I don't read newspapers as such. I mean, I try and look at certain things, but I don't subject myself to all this. But why did I not hear about this kind of effective privatization thing? Why did I not know? It was different in France. There was a different approach. Some things, it's different in Belgium. In Belgium, they had, legitimately, I can understand it, they had, well, I went to see the Great Altarpiece in Ghent. And of course, you have to pay in that. Now, on principle, I'm not paying in to see a divine thing. It's not, you're going to have different mechanisms. But when you begin to transform it into a cultural commodity independent of your religious desire to see it, or it's different. So it's not being tight or anything like that, but there's a deep Rubicon we're past. So the totality of investment of all the artists, of all the culture, of all the princes, if you like, of all the kings, queens, of all the people that have invested in these things, have been taken like that. And what I'm saying, if people don't realize it, they're coming after your eternal soul, if you believe you have one. They're coming after your consciousness. They're coming after human consciousness. And the forces of opposition to it are minimal, really. And not only are they minimal, but they're taking a long time to begin to even formulate a robust analysis of what is happening in order to be able to even suggest a way forward. And that's the frightening thing. So, and again, the cosmetic, the control and access, control and appearance, it's kind of a deeper cosmetic thing. It's interfering in your access to something deeper.
It's so what really stands out, what really stood out there to me, is this mechanism. It's the concrete the notion of the universal heritage site, right, or that category of universal heritage, which is being invoked by UNESCO, very inviting rhetorically. If you don't think about it too much, like, oh, that's a nice idea, and there's like there's a dimension, there's a facet of truth in it, just a glimmer, right? You can't just dismiss it out of hand because we are connected. There is a common human heritage, right? But the problem is it becomes an empty signifier of sorts. Like, well, what is the human heritage? And it's when you come to that level of abstraction, you're almost utterly unmoored from the physicality of the world in a deep way. And it's a very effective displacement of the question into a sphere which allows your opponent, if I'm just going to grant that this is actually an antagonistic conversation from the beginning, to operate without boundary. Because they don't have the accountability of the concrete or the physical, of the carnal even, they can play in the discourse in a way which cannot be countered by mere logic, right? Because they've actually displaced the whole conversation to a terrain without axiom. You need to be grounded in, and forgive me if I'm sort of apostrophizing a bit here, right? Uh, because it's a difficult issue because there's still this residue of veracity, of residue. It's not actual bona fide veracity, right? But you can look at how something like Irish heritage then becomes sort of subsumed within European heritage, which of course is kind of offensive, actually, in its own way, right? And then within human heritage, and then people are culturally giving up the sovereignty of their own idiomatic lives, right? Their own vernacular. In many respects, I'm reminded of the analysis of Ivan Illich in his book Gender, for which he sort of metaphorically got pilloried. Um, where he talks about how, but we can't go. And in any event, there's no going back, right? This is where we are. As you said, the Rubicon has been crossed. So the question then becomes, how do we respond to that impasse? Is it just sort of by revivifying our relationship with the concrete? That's sort of trivially true, if not utterly satisfying. I don't know. I'm just sort of responding to your thoughts there. I don't know if you have anything else there to which.
Well, the starting point of my work in recent years was the starting point of the need for spiritual evolution, or meaning that implicit in that is that it wasn't about physical evolution; it was about the natural growth that we were meant to have in our spiritual consciousness, which has been hijacked as well. But anyway, whatever way you want to call it, about developing and improving your spiritual context. And I believe that to be the root of the problem. The attack and the denial of the spirit is the root, going back as well to Machiavellian context and going back to the sidelining of any structures of belief. So it's okay. We'll say, as a father figure, for example, it's okay to do that and then celebrate indigenous people who celebrate a great father. That's okay, but not in our culture. There's different contradictions in a number of these contexts. But so spirit, I know it sounds corny, but the whole point is, all this is proving to us the consequences of having yielded our spiritual consciousness, because we have no frames of reference. We have no sense of meaning. We have no sense of truth in a deep sense. So therefore, everything is subject to cosmetic appearance, and we fall for every failed claim on our goodness, like the fox and the crow dropping the cheese. And of course, who is involved in UNESCO? Julian Huxley. So when you begin to look you can make these claims about what they were doing, and then you look at who these people are: Julian Huxley, transhumanism, the person, and then you begin to understand, which is the key point, as H.G. Wells explained, and as people don't understand, that nearly all of these international bodies were set up by the empires, but in particular the British Empire, the Food and Agricultural Organization. They were the British Empire. You know, they don't have a good record. I can tell you, I've come from Ireland, they don't have a good record on looking after agriculture, but people have believed that these imperialists are going to control the future. I mean, so in this, there is a kind of mea culpa, we need to reinterpret some of these ideas. Mea culpa, people see it as a kind of blame, a kind of pathetic sense of blaming yourself. But culpa, culpable, responsibility. What we have to do is take responsibility for ourselves and for our community or family, and build from there. It comes from responsibility. And the chief responsibility, which transcends gender and anything else, is a responsibility to your spiritual consciousness, whatever way you do that, but it's accepting the reality of this spiritual consciousness. So that is the starting point. So there's two sides to it. Our spiritual consciousness and understanding, if you want to put on a right brain, whatever way you want all those working out, and the idea of phronesis, I think, the idea of wisdom applied to practical context. And on the left brain approach, we need to analyze what the problem is, because there has been an utter fragmentation conceptually, another siloization, which has created a mosaic of meaning that is without authority and consequence. So that, for example, in the circumstances you talked about in relation to, say, mandates and all that. So if you read the Supreme Court judgment in denial of forced injections in corporate context and whatever, the basis was on the failure of authority. The Supreme Court, the majority, decided that there was no authority for the institutions to do this. And what that vindicates, what's it pointing to on that issue alone, not wide enough for a lot of people, but on that issue, is this notion of authority. And if you trace the authority, of course, in the constitutions, they all always go back to God. There was no, and Machiavelli talks about this, and even Machiavelli defends this for pragmatic reasons. Every lawgiver claimed authority from God. That's it. The connection between jurisprudence, law, rules, modalities, principles, of course, another basis of the origin principle. The principle is critical. So we've changed from the logos to the principle, and the principle is a techno principle, a scientific principle of leadership, which is true. So there's two simple things. First thing is to accept and realize that the significance of your spiritual consciousness. And I think, for me, is to accept that there comes with that a responsibility. And for me, there's also consequences. I believe that the universe is an inherently, has its own sense of justice. Martin Luther King talked about the long arc of history in relation to justice. But even if you look at near-death experiences and that, people get a sense of justice from the journey into the higher world. And it may be the origin of justice. It may be where ideas began to come from our moving into altered state. The implication is that on a higher order, these principles are reflected there, that this is written into the universe. It also implies that if we give it up, well, we have to take the consequences. And so it's nothing about like a God of the Old Testament or whatever you want, or an angry God or whatever. All these spiritual traditions are telling you about the consequence of your own actions, that it is consequential. So I don't shy away from that. I think we need to say that more, that there is a responsibility. I don't care what people don't, they've made a taboo to talk about moral responsibility or spiritual responsibility or whatever. Now, the first responsibility is to ourselves. They've shifted it so people make other people responsible for other people's morals thing. That's not what it's about. It's starting from oneself in concentric circles in relation to exemplars and action. And the idea in all the spiritual traditions is as well as the idea of spiritual gifts or siddhi, that when one commits to a journey, that one begins to develop appropriate gifts necessary for the tasks which one has engaged in. So people don't believe in that because it doesn't seem to be logical that you can expand in a way that is relevant to a task, but it depends on your volition and your commitment to the thing. So we can't underestimate that. One of the great, and you touched on this in your talk on Machiavelli on that. It goes in some ways in simple terms. You could look at Ian McGilchrist, but it's a deeper thing than that. That there are two trends. One, people who need predictability, who need a sense that they have control over their environment. And two, the opposite side, people that are willing to succumb to the universe and accept that they're not going to be able to control things, and they're not going to be able to be certain about that there is going to be mystery. It's inherent. And we can look at Gödel and theories of uncertainty and that. The other side needs control. That's what sorcery is about. That's what the entire history of sorcery is about, developing codes, rituals, cryptography, in order to exert their power on the world in intelligence context and in relation to unseen intelligences, the total system. I want to come back on Arthur C. Clarke as a next point, but we also have to get wise. We have to get wise to the cartoonish nature of our public discourse. And the more we participate in it, the more we go on the slippery slope, which I believe has personal consequences. If we are, say that, take that even as a hypothetical, if we are eternal beings, eternal consciousness, and we continue to deny it, we continue to not accept it, we continue to refuse it, at a certain point, the universe is going to say, okay, well, we'll let you take the consequences of your decision. So
we will get to Clarke here momentarily, but it's my own sort of hobby horse with reference to responsibility, how vital it seems to me the rejection of the predominance of digital technology needs to be. Pragmatically, here we are, we're employing this technology right now. So that does not escape me. That irony does not escape me. But when you look at these modalities such as ChatGPT and AI more generally, pragmatically, there will be severe repercussions if we continue down this path. I am personally horrified at people's willingness to just jump on that bandwagon and then begin to use a language generation software as component to their own creative processes. To me, it is transparent that the only thing that is going to do is degrade your capacity as a creator and pervert, mutate that process so as that it becomes more subject to the imperative of the machine that is, the heart of things like ChatGPT. And I realize, of course, my language is harsh. It's acerbic, but I'm not going to apologize for that. I think that because I don't think it takes a great effort of thought to appreciate what a catastrophic error it would be to give over the miracle of human language to software, which is just iterating stochastic protocols. So that's all it really does. Once you know how the sausage is made, it's far more difficult for it to impress you. But I just that's my in terms of, and it's not just ChatGPT. That's like a token. It can be like even something as mundane as tap and pay. I mean, it's ridiculous. Why when people want to like integrate everything into their phone so they don't have to carry a wallet? And then the next step, of course, is, even though it sounds cartoonish now, right, is that you have it all integrated into a chip, which is in your wrist. And um, I'm just asking people to awaken to the to all these sort of small things, because like one or the other thing might be dismissible as relatively small, but overall you're giving yourself over to a system which is indifferent to your own and even hostile to your own existence as a human being, and it is in fact spiritually poisonous. So that's me getting on my little soapbox. So,
Well,
but um, that's just, I just wanted to sort of build on what you were saying there.
well, Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels has an AI machine where the fool can enable to write stories, and that he anticipated that when his critique of scientists, who he was very well able to see beyond. And of course, we have the simulacrum, the facade, the cosmetic thing again. You know, the cosmetic art. Oh, here I've written a book. This is what I've done with ChatGPT, or you can do all this. So it's a similar thing. On the point in relation to using the technology, this is another point that we have to iterate. Alvin Toffler, the Luddites, the people that using the technology, and of course they accuse anyone of being Luddite. They don't agree. But the third category is the techno rebel, and the techno rebel is the person he predicted correctly who would become the dominant force, who understand technology but believe it's gone too far. So they don't abandon technology; they use it, like all the opponents have done, going back to the scientists in the infiltration and the X Club, and or as Trotsky would argue, you don't abandon the thing, you take it over. So, so the idea that we shouldn't be using technology because we're criticizing it is just an absurd one that people shouldn't tolerate. And they usually go on and say something like, "Well, if you don't want this chip, you should be running around naked, etc." We shouldn't tolerate these arguments. We should criticize people, some respectable intellectuals that are saying these things. And again, it's all in relation to the mythic element. But you're getting toward the point there in relation to software, in relation to language, in relation to this turning everything into the digital language, in relation to dataism, the new religion, the new God, as Yuval Noah Harari has called it, the reduction to the binary system, the idea that everything, including human body, mind, spirit, is a story which is reducible to its component parts. And again, Yuval Noah Harari, I use the story now. I'm writing about the idea of the story in relation to technology. So I understand it, and you understand it. But the idea that everything is just a story is absurd, and people are swallowing this stuff. They're swallowing all this nonsense, and they're letting these people away with it. And they have responsibilities. The people that are shutting up now, they have responsibility not just for themselves but for other people. You can't force people, to engage in things. I ask them to do it for themselves, because in the end, it's your soul they're after. This is the key thing. And in relation to the principalities in Ephesians, we wrestle not with flesh and blood, and the principalities in the negative sense, in the dark sense. The irony is that these people believe in those things. They don't always tell us about it, but they're locked into some of these things when you begin to look around their work, when you begin to look at, they believe in the power of these things. But they don't want you to believe in the good principality, because that would defeat this. The bitter prince that's coming to power. They all had a fascination with, a lot of them, the key thinkers had a fascination with esoteric things. If you read about Trotsky in jail and what he's reading, for example, very much, and he wanted the superhuman. His future human was the superhuman, a technically advanced human being that had miraculously kind of got this increased intelligence. this increased intelligence is one of the myths as well of the argument. You're going to get increased intelligence, which of course is complete opposite. And this is a myth, a fable. It's in all the Irish stories about being able to touch the salmon of knowledge, and you miraculously get an influx of intelligence. It's mythic, and there's other dimensions to it, but it's mythic in its present fable form with the snake oil and that of AI, which we'll talk about another form. But it goes back to deeper stories. All of these principalities reflect a deeper principality. It's not accidental that Machiavellian methods lead to certain results. They lead to blood and guts, whatever, because that's part engendered in the machine thing. And it's interesting. If you want to find about certain organizations, you have to look at what they're looking at. For example, I could see in relation to radical active Republicans in Ireland, certain times I heard them talking about, they were talking to the ragged trousered philanthropist. I got into an argument with a guy that I got on well with, who was active kind of Republican at the time. And it's another story, we go back on that, but about the ragged trousered philanthropist. And whether I had read it or not was a silly debate, and it was a kind of important one. And then it became, you could see Franz Fanon, the wretched of the world. I could hear this, and I said, well, what's that about? What's that got to do with Ireland? And these things were signals. And if you hear Michael Francis, the former, the mafia guy that does podcasts and that and become very popular, he emphasizes how the mafia used to read the Prince. So that was their manual. Now, so you have to begin to look at what is the apparatus of structure of the groups, of the principalities, of the corporate groups. Ironically, the mafia, as we know it in the United States, are only schoolboys towards the groups that we're dealing with. And when you look back at Propaganda Due in Italy and the history of that, for example, as a secret state, really, that would utilize assassination, murder, corruption, whatever, for whatever purposes, you're getting a sense of what the future world is about. This is the order that they will be able to adapt communists, capitalists, billionaires, and criminals easily into all this system, because there'll be plenty of spoils initially. And there's another thing about this. People keep saying to me, but it couldn't be, if you're working for the system, you couldn't. You'd have to. They believe that the people involved in the system have to understand everything in order to participate. But power is run in concentric circles. So one circle doesn't have to know exactly. They only have to do whatever their function is in accordance with the leverage applied to them. So there's a whole range of useful idiots in this equation. Sorry.
I mean, the thing is that a lot of people are ideologically captured. They don't understand. They don't understand. They haven't thought through the implications of the process. And for example, I had a conversation with this fellow a few weeks ago. Probably have him on again because I feel sorts of things need to be confronted. He's involved in genetic research, and he thinks that aging is a disease. It needs to be cured. And he himself, he's a very affable fellow. I would say his intentions are genuinely good, but he's failing to grasp that working on that kind of thing and that kind of approach to the human condition is making him an instrument of really terrible despotism, right? So that's probably the case with the vast majority of people within the system. It's not that they are within the upper echelon or the inner circle and that they're like in on it. It's that they have been effectively captured by the so-called useful myths, which are propagated or constructed or built by those toward the apex of these structures or within these networks. And even they, I think, often are sort of like believe their own malarkey. Um, you know, I think probably Bill Gates is a sincere person, albeit one whom I consider to be fundamentally despicable. Um, So yes, right. It's not that there, you know, so what it comes down to is that really ardent criticism of the powerful does not entail the rejection of the vast majority of human beings. You are criticizing a small segment of the population, but oftentimes that criticism is mistaken as a fundamental pessimism about people in general. And I think that has to be just rejected out of hand. Now, I'm actually fundamentally my fundamental conviction is the vast majority of people are fundamentally good. Just there's an excess of naivete that sort of runs around, and it's the leveraging of that naivete which makes the bad apples capable of wrecking such havoc as they do.
Oh, there's no question about that. However, there is certain times in your life, certain times in the world, certain times in the universe where things become critical, and that neutrality is not an option, and neutrality becomes appropriated. And of course, when you're saying those things, this was fundamental, as you know, in Hannah Arendt's work in relation to her study of Eichmann and the mentality of Eichmann. And when you begin to study, the Wannsee conference and the preparation for the Holocaust, and it was about bureaucracy. And bureaucracy has an incredible way of depersonalizing function, and people therefore believe they have no responsibility for it, even though if we look back at the principles underlying the Geneva Convention or the Nuremberg principles, there's an assumption that you have to be able to transcend something which is illegal. You still have a responsibility, even legally, notionally, to transcend something which is clearly wrong. They also, as well, another principle that people have forgotten about in relation to the Geneva Convention is that there can be no collective punishment. We've come to an idea that there is collective punishment. You can have collective punishment if you belong to a certain group that's not in, for example. So we're really jettisoning a lot of fundamental truths that are deep truths about justice. And certainly, but I'm optimistic, but we're all participating in this movement. So we can either do it with a critical, non-violent, rebellious awareness of the thing, but the option to submit to the servitude is an invitation to sell your soul to the systems, and AI systems are so comprehensive that the human cognition will be overridden, and you will be giving up your soul in that at a certain state. Now, this is an important thing that people don't understand about spirits. And there's been a presentation of spirits as all these, bad spirits as kind of ugly, nasty things. But the word intelligence is important. They're accorded intelligence in this thing. They're able to do things. That's why people wanted to use them. So therefore, the danger is that people assume that they know what things are bad, because of this function of intelligence, where badness resides in intelligence and in certain types of intelligence, which are purely instrumental, which are uninformed by the higher values, truth, justice, whatever, in any real sense, and they're being hijacked and changed. So you do get I was interested in looking again at some Marian sites and investigating a bit more when I was in Europe, which is interesting. And you do have a sense of this, the Marian apparitions, going back to Celeste and that of choice, and or Garabandal, which is a very interesting context. It's not an approved vision, but of the idea of a choice being made. Now, the problem is that a lot of choices are made in little things, as C.S. Lewis talked about, by little acquiescences. And some of those little acquiescences can have big consequences. So I agree with you, of course, in relation to the goodness. In fact, all my arguments about the inherent creativity and compassion that individuals possess in consciousness. The original sin idea, while it has diminished in traditional context, is alive and kicking in the social justice world. It's alive and kicking in Machiavelli, because it's starting with original sin. So this is one of the paradoxes of it, that the people that deny these things most are the ones that utilize them. So you have an original sin because, you know, you're a certain person coming from a certain group. And not only that, it's a sin that can't be cleansed. It's incapable of being cleansed because it's decided by the collective, by the principality. And for whatever manipulative purposes, they can designate people with eternal sins. This is the ascribed role that this new dataism tech god is going to do. Make no mistakes about this. Make no mistakes about the consequence of this. Make no mistake about their commitment or lack of commitment to human life. The idea that they're busily worried about our lives and extending our lives, it's just a cod. It's so ridiculous. When at the same time,
for the transhumanists, the original sin is having a body, ultimately. Yeah. You know, the fact that you are enfleshed is already an offense.
Well, because it's weak and it's vulnerable and it suffers. That's the thing in their view. That's the real, you know, if it was a body that didn't be okay, they could probably deal with it. But it's this idea of weakness, which also is the starting point of Buddhist philosophy. People kind of gloss over a bit too much about the similarities between in a totally different way. It doesn't go in the same direction, but in relation to some of the correspondences that people utilize between the idea of rejection of suffering and technological alteration to the body and technosis and other ideas like that. But we can talk about that some other time. Sorry.
We certainly can. I think that I mean, my view is that the actual Buddhist positions are fundamentally coherent, but they're grievously misunderstood and then abused by Western, maybe not Western appropriation. All right. But they say judge the tree by its fruits, right? And really, when you look at devout religious practitioners of any tradition,
yes,
whether that be Buddhist or Muslim or Jewish or Catholic or Lutheran or what have you, right? When you look at people who are devoutly committed to them, then what I have met are people who seem to be exemplifying human being in the best way. And because
I agree with that. Yeah.
Because all these major traditions, when they are invoked, seem to produce really wonderful people or help people realize what it is to be wonderful in their own right. I just can't reject them out of hand. I can't necessarily say the same of all.
I don't. Yeah, just to clarify, I've laid it out in my work about my support of the religious and philosophical tradition and Buddhism.
Yes.
What I'm talking about is the misapplication and co-option and appropriation of some of these ideas in the context in which we're talking. Just to clarify that.
Right. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, yeah, it was
water
important.
there, because it's a hijacking, right? So the Buddhist notion of mindfulness and meditation being hijacked. That, well, this is something you can do to give yourself an edge. It's the illegitimate cultivation of siddhis or spiritual powers.
Yes,
for dark ends is actually what it is, right? But I wanted to bring up, because I didn't want to lose the thread. You wanted to talk more about Arthur C. Clarke. I don't know if you want to talk more about him.
I do, because it's an important one that came up when I was thinking about just certain things come into my head. And you said about the thread. Of course, this is another key idea of the thread doctrine and whether we're linked to God or whether we're linked to something else. So we follow the thread. And so when Machiavelli is talking about fortuna, we can also think of the fates spinning, and they have connections with thread and our destiny. So there is a kind of implication, although it's not explicit. And there is some talk in Machiavelli where he seems to be talking with spirits or whatever. So I don't know enough about. I have to look back on some of these issues. But the objective of the subjugation of the net idea, in Indra's net, or of the thread idea, and particularly through Indian mythology, spirituality, it's very, very important, and is infiltrated and is consistent with other or thread doctrines in all cultures, and native cultures. They all have this thread doctrine, indigenous cultures, Celtic cultures. And it is absolutely clear that part of the mechanization, materialization of the and the building of the technosphere is true appropriation of ancient myths. So when they're talking about the net and the web, they're consciously appropriating and using it. They're going to immanentize it. They're going to instantiate it. They're going to turn it into a material reality, what was a reflection of a much higher level idea. So that thread area is important. And of course, all these networks were laid out initially by cable, which is another thread, but there's a deep mythic connection in this. It's not just a technical thing. It comes from a very, very deep idea of connecting and ensnaring things. And the poet Robertson Jefferson, California, has a poem in the 1920s about the purse seiners, and he's seeing the similarities between the net that's catching the sardines at night in Monterey and humans. So it's, they were aware of this, I think, and particularly in California. You see it in Orson Welles as well, in the trial. He's using this, or Othello, the net, as we talked about. So we've talked about the thread thing, but again, the world is laid out in this cable thing. Now, there's a book which I was looking at, again, just as one book as an example, because people say, oh, you talk about this, you talk about that, you talk about this. But just as a simple example to concretize it, the book Arthur C. Clarke, which is old, 30 years old, How the World Was Won, and one is critical, of course, how the world was won. One is a real materialist claim to unify everything. The turbulent history of global communications. Now, I used to lecture on communications technology, so I read a lot of stuff, and I was always interested in Arthur C. Clarke. He's a critical chain in the link, because he goes back to some of the guys that are around at the time of the war, and he comes up to the end of the century, and he's bringing up. So we see where he came from, and we see where he was intending to go to. So he is a person who said that H.G. Wells and Bernal J.D. Bernal expressed his kind of worldview, and he said his particular bringing into this kind of globalization process was in 1947, from a lecture by Arnold Toynbee in Senate House and University College London, Russell Square. I've talked about that again. It's always around there. The Russell Square is critical. I did a video on that, explaining some of the absurdly connections and explanations there. But anyway, 1947, Toynbee gives a lecture explaining exactly what I've claimed in the book, that the empire, effectively, if you read it closely, the Anglo-American sphere was going to set up the scaffolding of what effectively is the new world order to bring people together. He lays it out there. Now, people hear him, Toynbee, and they believe he's some kind of spiritual, they hear different things about these authors. So that inspired Arthur C. Clarke, supposedly, this is the story, to get involved in this process. And of course, he's associated with the communication satellite, the idea for some of the theoretical basis of the communication satellite. And so he's in this thing, which is the trinity of this transhumanist movement about space exploration, life extension, and intelligence increase. This is the thing that Bernal, all the guys in the 20s, saw as the mechanism for the future. So this is the way you kind of recognize some people that are in that trajectory. And that's why Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna are probably more aligned with that than people understand, for example. So if you look at actually what they said, if you engage in textual analysis as opposed to what you think they said or what cosmetically they may have appeared to have said. So he gets involved in this, and so this book was about describing the growth of this network and the laying down of the cables. And we've talked about before, it was all laid down, the British sea routes, etc. So you get the laying down of the telegraph, and you get the International Postal Union, and you get the and nobody's against these things because they see them as good. Of course, there's benefits to them. The telegraph system, then the radio system, the television system, the communication satellite, all the stuff. It's all of the one piece. So when we talk about distinctive technologies like television, they're all aspects of the network, cable and wireless, when it comes together. So they're all aspects of the technological governance of the globe of images, text, whatever, signals. All that infrastructure going back to the 1850s, as was appreciated, as we begin to appreciate by Dostoevsky, when he sees this and he identifies it with Baal when he goes to the great exhibition in London, he's perceiving a different dimension. So it's interesting, he perceives it as connected with Baal and going back to the Middle East. So you see this similar thing in critiques about Bohemian Grove and the Moloch and this strange fascination, and we can see that Ginsberg wrote about Moloch as representing this modernity in his poetry. So we also have, you can see it in people like David Icke going back to the Middle East, and you say, well, is that true? Is there any kind of continuity in that, or is that just a made up story? And especially when we're talking about people that make this claim about rationality and about, everything is rational. And of course, Arthur C. Clarke says that the future will be merger of humans and machine. And Elon Musk, I think last year, tweeted something about Arthur C. Clarke's speech on September 21, 1964, or broadcast on BBC, where he explains about future artificial intelligence. Now, of course, he was technically gifted, but he was also reading the script for Empire. He's telling you what he's priming you on the basis of inside knowledge, So some of his predictions are descriptions of policies that are coming. And of course, we have 2001: A Space Odyssey, and then it brings into to all the film context, what that's about, and AI, etc. But so in this book, as an example, he gives a description of all the technical, gory details. No, that's not. It's an interesting story about laying the cables and all that kind of stuff. A lot of people don't understand how these things worked, how significant the cables were, how the small groups, which were, I think, in America they were called the cable cabal, interestingly. These groups of the kind of what used to be, they seem to have disappeared. The WASPs, that category seems to have disappeared because it's been generalized now. But this group of kind of people coming from a particular intellectual milieu with power from the colonial context were behind this system. So in the end of this book, he's considering the kind of context of this communication system. And he refers back to a story that he wrote, a short story. And it was the only short story that he wrote in which his own name is in it. So he's Arthur C. Clarke, okay? So he refers back to a short story that he wrote, and he puts in a chapter called I Remember Babylon. I can't remember if this is the name of the story. It's called I Remember Babylon, okay? And this comes at the end of his book as well. He refers back. So you go back and you look at the story I Remember Babylon. So it's Arthur C. Clarke with his name. And when I'm thinking about him using the name, he's telling you that he's kind of boasting about it. It kind of appears to me as like, someone at the scene of the crime coming back for a trophy or something. And so he meets this fella. It's not a great story. There's nothing in it. And he said he made it personal to explain or to make it more dramatic. It's not dramatic in any way, but I find it very revealing. So basically, he meets this guy internationally, and the guy said, "Oh, Arthur C. Clarke, that's some conference or something. Arthur C. Clarke, oh, I know who you are. and then they have a discussion. And we say, we have to thank you for your communication satellite, and that means everything has changed, of course, and we won't have any more censorship, and national borders are gone, which is true, by the way. I mean, coming from a legal perspective, the technological result of this was critical in relation to changing the Westphalian state as it was for hundreds of years. So that is true. And I always took that as a statement of fact about the world, that really had re-engineered the world. So all that is true. And it was meant to be true. That was, I'm suggesting that there is a policy towards that, towards eradicating through technological means of the old concepts. So this guy then proceeds and he says, well, we're going to use this technology, this supposedly fictional character that has some control over the private commercialization of the satellites in this story. And he says, we're going to use this. And where the implication in the story, to cut the short story shorter, is that they're going to use this communication satellites in order to control and change culture, and in particular to change the United States. In it, the guy said, well, our Bible is the McKinsey report. So the point or the argument is they were going to utilize pornography and sexual relations and claims to sexual relations in order to use the communication satellite as a methodology to dismantle existing allegiances. That's the implication in the story. But so that's kind of interesting. It's kind of reflecting what I believe is a realpolitik, is a description. And there's something strange in the story. One can make up their own mind. And he says who this guy is. Arthur C. Clarke says, oh, you work for that organization, the organization that the United States pretends doesn't exist. You know, who he's talking about, again, it's consistent with invisible government of Bernays, the Principality, whatever way you want to call it. But there's always this idea, consistent with H.G. Wells, that this scientific elite would take over and use these things and use these mechanisms and studies in different contexts to change psychology. And of course, cybernetics and psychiatry are fundamentally linked. But in the end, the guy says, you know, I'm fond of the United States, but a cold wind blows through me and I remember Babylon. And this I found amazing, that they're locating the future technological thing in Babylon. And Arthur C. Clarke is telling us something here. And he finishes off this book. And I read this book years ago, and I probably read it or looked at it a couple of times or for references or see what he was saying about a particular thing. It's not, because it's not spellbinder or anything, but you have to look at detail. And in the end of it, he refers back to, Arthur C. Clarke refers back to Babylon and the Tower of Babel or Babel, whatever you want to call it. And he talks about this a lot. And he refers back to Genesis. Now, here's a man that kind of ridicules religion and even ridiculed the use of satellites for, you know, for televangelism. That was a bad use. Pornography seemed to be okay, but using it to spread religion would be bad. It's unbelievable. And that hatred of have a religion. And he refers back to Genesis, and Genesis 11, and the Tower of Babel, Tower of Babel. And in that, God is saying, oh, they're getting one voice and they're getting one language, and now they're building the bricks to the heavens. This is the more or less what the text says, and therefore there's an intervention to have the different languages. And Arthur C. Clarke says, well, if you read Scientific America, something like half the world's languages, or 60% of the world's languages, came from an area north of Babylon, according to some scientific report. And what they had described this intervention as was a curse. They use the word curse, which is not a kind of word that you'd associate with the divine in many senses. So what he makes clear is that this interference from the divine in the building of this Tower of Babel now is going to be superseded. This time, they're not going to be unsuccessful. this time they're going to get over that curse, as he called it. So he locates, after all that, he locates this consciously or kind of unconsciously. He locates all this network building really in the myth of the Tower of Babel. And he says, funny enough, it's more than a myth, suggesting that he took as real this principle. And in it again, we have the principality asserting itself. It's this classic principle. It's the classic myth, if you want. It's the classic mythos of Prometheus defying the gods, of satanic, Luciferian, whatever way, or the Asuras. If you look at Sri Aurobindo and his article on criticizing Nietzsche and on supermanhood, he had said you had to distinguish between spiritual kind of super humanhood, or the move developing yourself spiritually, and this effort to materialize it, or to immanentize the eschaton, or to do what C.S. Lewis said, to try and master nature, and instead of becoming subject to the Tao. So it struck me this week when I was thinking about it. I said, that's a kind of remarkable. When I'm looking at the mythic element, it really is a remarkable admission that I'm sure I'd glossed over. But when I see it in context of what the man is saying very, very clearly and through his work, he's signaling a deeper intent, a deeper engagement with this principality and myths. So he's not rejecting Genesis. He's just saying it's not going to work that way again. We are becoming the gods. And that's clear. So we go from H.G. Wells, Arthur C. Clarke, H.G. Wells, Bernal, all those guys around there, move on to Arthur C. Clarke as a statement of spokesman for the principality. Yuval Noah Harari, they're saying the same thing. Homo Deus, you're a fool if you don't understand it. Your life is meaningless. You're an animal. You're lower than an animal. You're an animal that can be controlled. You're a domestic animal. You're lower than that. You're a digital pattern. You're a digital pattern. That's a blight on the face of the earth. This is what they're saying. This is their argumentation. This is their moral position. And that comes from this deep, deep sense that is in there, that is connected, as was perceived by artists, to some kind of rejection, a deep rejection of the Judeo-Christian, Western whole on a deeper level, and a desire to defy that. And that is in it. I mean, they're saying, that's what they're saying. Now, my arguments have always been based on what the scientists and relevant people have said or what they've done. Now, one can come to a different interpretation of what he said, but it is very, very strange for me and very, very revealing. And I think that I really believe that this so-called high-tech, neutral, objective, progressive attempt is a dark intellectual, psychic, and spiritual force, Aramanic force, etc., whatever way you want to call it, consistent with the Asuras, as Aurobindo would say, that appears to be something else, and the appearance as speaking to people, the shiny bit, the chromium fence, if you like, that Philip K. Dick talked about.
Yes. I think that's, it was remarkable listening to you, because before you brought up Babel or Babylon at all, as you were just initially sketching what Arthur C. Clarke was saying, I kept thinking, oh, this is just like Babylon, the idea of bringing everything. And I even was struck by like the homonym in the title, how the world was one, WON, but also ONE, this drive to a kind of unification, right? So, and then the establishment in terms of threads and networks there. Another thing is with the creation of new networks, it seems to me that there is a rejection of the fact that the world is already networked in a deeper way. And, there's, you get to get into ley lines and all that, but for whatever the reality or unreality of those older stories may be, there's an intuition as to connections which were already extant, but which are being rejected by the creation of this counter network, right? But it all, I mean, I'm inclined to, see it as you, that there's a darkness in this project, and a resentment, like when in that line, the cold wind blows through me, and I remember Babylon. There's this resentment of the implications of the Babylonian story, the confusion of men's tongues, right? And then this, so drive to create new ways of communication through the digital that brings everything together. So I actually hate all these like language translation applications, right? I've had it happen to me where people will come up and they will use their phone. They may speak like Spanish or something, and they want to say something to me, and then they'll use their phone to translate whatever they want to communicate. I won't. I won't even look at the phone. It's like, no, I hate that, right? But it's actually the Babylonian impulse. Uh, but we should. I mean, we could go on from there, but we're talking for a bit, so perhaps we should wrap it up. But that's really, I think, a great sort of point from which to at least adjourn the conversation, right? Um, that Scientocracy itself is related to a project of principality, but a different kind of principality, which is itself founded in this alternative vision, which is articulated by a few people, but we can close with Arthur C. Clarke's rendering, in part because of its unusual mythic resonance.
Absolutely, yeah. It's clear that the claim to diversity and the claim to being one is irreconcilable in many senses. That diversity is a charade, it's a technique, it's a mode, and it's cosmetic. I think people will suffer behind it when they see what they lose through the process. And not against any cosmopolitanization or that, but I'm against the strategic manipulation by forces that don't appeal to me for their own forces with a deliberate destructive attempt of other things. And we have to be aware of those possibilities. And the idea of that unification being something else. I suspect that Genesis could be written or articulated in a different way that would frame the story in a way which was more understandable if we re-articulate the just on the language that's there about what's the divine message, if you like, is meant to be about, or what if you want to call it the mythic element, or whatever is in it. But it was true for these people. When people act as if, we have to take it seriously. So yeah, it's important to put these things into equation. I'd reiterate that in the exploration of an analysis which is robust, with continuity, with historical support, with philosophical rigor, with dialogue, discourse, framing, discussion, testing of hypothesis, that a robust analysis will appear. And when it appears, it will become harder for it to be sold to us. And the alternative strategies will emerge. They won't emerge until we've come to something properly. I've said in another article I wrote the other day that we can't be going around the ones that begin to wake up in the proper sense of wake up. They anticipated that waking up, and that's why they put in the simulacrum of the woke, deliberately constructed, because they knew people will wake up from the hypnosis, from the spell, from the broadcasting, all that kind of stuff. I've said that what we can't do at the moment is go around fighting on all fronts, or opening a war on all fronts, in our Y fronts, if you like, or whatever people wear. That we really can't do it until we analyze what the problem is, and analyze what the solution is, and analyze what the bigger moral, the cosmic moral of this story is. And that's why these dialogues are important. So again, thank you for your time, Thomas. I've enjoyed your other work. I've enjoyed the discussions about with Professor Quinn. I listened to that, and also in relation to your discussions about Gunther Anders, I think is an important contribution, and your discussion with Christian Roy about and he's very important in relation to Carbonneau and Jacques Ellul, and these are important people, and Babette Babich, they're important people to put into the equation because they have a deep knowledge of the field, and we can see some contours coming out. So at least we can begin to look in the right places, to look at continuities. And for example, that idea of exclusion of critical voice, it's kind of remarkable in both cases. The lack of translation of these critical voices is a kind of theme that vindicates analysis of the propaganda model. So good luck with your work. I'm enjoying it, and I look forward to future dialogue, and thanks for your courtesy and your interaction.
Likewise, James, I'm very grateful to you as well for your time, and your erudition continues to impress. So
Thanks.
thank you very much. Hey, you have a good afternoon or a good evening, and talk to you soon.
Good luck.
Bye for now.